It is a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life. It can all be condensed into a single sentence. And that sentence you will find in Gray's Elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor. That's my life, and that's all you or anyone else can make of it. Abraham Lincoln.
Hello, I'm Kent Masterson Brown. Welcome to Witnessing History's I Remember the Old Home Very Well, the Lincolns in Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln. The world knows that he was born in a log cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky and that he became the 16th President of the United States. Nearly 16,000 books have been written about Lincoln's life, but the world really does not know very much about Lincoln's family. His grandfather's and grandmother's migration to and settlement in Kentucky, his mother, father, sister, or brother, or why the Lincolns left Kentucky. This is the story of the Lincolns in Kentucky. It is a story that has never been told in book form or on the screen before. It is a story of a pioneer family in the years following the Revolutionary War in Kentucky, of loss and sadness, of a determination to make life better and to raise a family in the midst of want and hardship. Most of the documents you will see have never been published in any form before. They were uncovered during the production of this film. Join me as we explore one of the most authentic of all American stories, the Lincolns in Kentucky.
I Remember the Old Home Very Well, The Lincolns in Kentucky, is brought to you by the Hardin County History Museum and the Ancestral Trails Historical Society, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. A sense of past time and place. Dupree Financial Group, Lexington, Kentucky. The citizens of LaRue County and Hodgenville, Kentucky. The Springfield Tourism Commission, Springfield, Kentucky. The McConnell Center at the University of Louisville, Louisville, Kentucky. The Bourbon County Distilling Company, Paris, Kentucky. The Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and the Lincoln Forum, New York, New York. And the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, Lincoln Memorial University, Harrogate, Tennessee. And generous gifts from Bill and Dottie Spears, Paris, Kentucky. Mac and Sharon Cox, Richmond, Kentucky, and Dr. Priscilla Lind, Lexington, Kentucky.
The Lincolns were of Old English stock. The first of that family to come to America was Samuel Lincoln, a Puritan from Norfolk County, England, who sailed to the New World as a weaver. Samuel Lincoln landed at Salem, Massachusetts in 1637. He lived the remainder of his life in Hingham, dying there at the age of 71 in 1690. By the early 18th century, John Lincoln, a great-grandson of Samuel Lincoln, was living in Berks County, Pennsylvania. John Lincoln would be the great-grandfather of President Abraham Lincoln. Born in Freehold, New Jersey in 1716, John Lincoln married Rebecca Flowers Morris, the widow of a James Morris. The marriage probably took place in Berks County, Pennsylvania, in 1743. 9 children, 5 sons and 4 daughters, were born to John and Rebecca Lincoln, the oldest of whom was Abraham, born in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 1744. John Lincoln and his family left Berks County around 1750 and migrated into the Shenandoah Valley, settling along Linville Creek in present-day Rockingham County, Virginia. It seems John Lincoln gave his son Abraham 200 acres of land on Linville Creek. Abraham Lincoln married Bathsheba Herring in 1770. Abraham and Bathsheba lived along Linville Creek for 10 years. Their marriage produced 5 children: Mordecai, Josiah, Mary, Thomas, and Nancy.
Right column left, mark.
Abraham Lincoln served during the Revolutionary War. He appears on the rolls of the militia of Augusta County, Virginia in 1776 and 1777 with the rank of captain. Captain Lincoln may have accompanied Daniel Boone and the Boone family on their return to Kentucky from the Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina in October 1779 in order to explore lands in Kentucky. The Boones and Lincolns were kin. Captain Lincoln returned to Virginia. He was issued 3 treasury warrants by Virginia in 1780 to claim land in Kentucky for his Revolutionary War service. This land grant, made out to Abram Lincoln, conveyed to him land along the Green River in what is now Lincoln County, Kentucky. Captain Lincoln, his wife Bathsheba, and their children, Mordecai, age 11, Josiah, age 8, Thomas, age 4, Mary, age 6, and the infant Nancy, and maybe other families, followed the Shenandoah Valley all the way to the Cumberland Gap, and then the Wilderness Road into present-day Kentucky in late 1781 or early 1782. Using Skaggs Trace, they reached Logan's Fort, and from there they journeyed along the Cumberland Settlements Trace to lands Captain Lincoln claimed along the headwaters of the Green River, altogether a 500-mile journey. The Lincolns first settled on the Green River property, but troubles with the Native American tribes north of the Ohio River and from those in present-day East Tennessee and North Georgia forced them to move to a less exposed location. The Lincolns journeyed to the waters of Long Run of Floyd's Fork in what is now Jefferson County, Kentucky, about 15 miles from present-day Louisville, in, it appears, late 1784. Captain Lincoln and his family first lived in the fortified station established by Morgan Hughes in 1780, known as Hughes's Station. It stood on the site where the ruins of the Long Run Baptist Church are found today.
Like that, right there.
42-year-old Captain Lincoln was accompanied by his youngest son, Thomas, then 8 years old, and his second son, Josiah, 13, while in the fields along Long Run on a fateful day in May 1786.
Here. Doing good, boys. Doing good.
A small band of Native American warriors, maybe from the tribes along the Wabash River, crept through the underbrush. One of them leveled his rifle at Captain Lincoln and fired. Captain Lincoln fell, killed instantly. Young Thomas screamed at the sight. The warrior ran toward the body of Captain Lincoln in order to take its scalp and to seize Thomas. Thomas's older brother Mordecai hurried out of the front gate of Hughes's Station, followed by his screaming mother. Mordecai quickly aimed his rifle and fired, killing the warrior. Little Thomas Lincoln would carry the scars of that day for the rest of his life. That terrified young boy would grow up to become the father of President Abraham Lincoln. Captain Lincoln, the grandfather and namesake of the future president, was buried near Hughes's Station. The log, long-run Baptist church would be built next to the grave in 1797. In 1806, the church would be built of stone. When the church was rebuilt of brick in 1844, it was expanded over the site of Captain Lincoln's grave. Somewhere within the ruins of the old church, the grave of the grandfather of President Abraham Lincoln remains today. In response to frequent Native American attacks, General George Rogers Clark commanded an expedition against the tribes north of the Ohio River. Among the weapons collected for use in the expedition was a gun the property of Widow Lincoln, valued at 8 pounds, that appeared on a subscription list dated September 6, 1786. Bathsheba Lincoln gave Clark's men one of Captain Lincoln's long rifles. Sometime between 1786 and 1789, the widow Bathsheba Lincoln and her 5 children moved to Beech Fork in what is now Washington County, Kentucky. Beech Fork is a tributary of the Salt River. The settlement there was about 6 miles from the town of Springfield, along a road to Frankfort in a long horseshoe bend of Beech Fork. Being coursed by a large stream and its tributaries, the land is undulating and hilly, with heavy woods along the stream and smaller creeks. Why Bathsheba chose to move to Beech Fork may be found in the fact that her deceased husband's kinsman, Hananiah Lincoln, owned land and had moved there too. Bathsheba's 5 children were raised in the community of Beech Fork. Living near Bathsheba Lincoln and her children was the family of Richard Berry Sr. and his wife, Rachel Shipley Berry. The Berrys had 6 children. By 1795, the Berrys had become the foster parents of 2 girls, Sarah Shipley Mitchell and Nancy Hanks. Sarah Shipley Mitchell was the daughter of Robert Mitchell and Naomi Shipley Mitchell of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Naomi Mitchell and Rachel Berry were sisters. Sarah's mother and many of her siblings were killed in 1790 in an attack by what were likely Chickamauga warriors near present-day Crab Orchard, Kentucky, at a site since known as Defeated Camp. Nancy Hanks was also living in the Berry home at the time the Lincolns arrived at Beech Fork. It appears she too was an orphan. It seems she was born in Campbell County, Virginia in 1784. Her mother, according to Abraham Lincoln, was a Lucy Hanks. That Lucy Hanks may have also been a Shipley and a sister to Rachel Berry and Naomi Mitchell. But her born name may have been Hanks, and she had given birth to Nancy Hanks out of wedlock. Some claim that Nancy's mother was the widow of a James Hanks, who died in Virginia. Lucy Hanks more than likely came from Virginia to Kentucky as a widow, along with her daughter Nancy. We will probably never really know with certainty the parentage of Nancy Hanks. For sure, Nancy Hanks and Sarah Mitchell became inseparable. They grew up together as though they were sisters. But what do we know about Thomas Lincoln, possibly shown here in later life? We know he was born along Linville Creek in Rockingham County, Virginia in 1778. Abraham Lincoln wrote of his father once in rather uncomplimentary terms.
Thomas Lincoln was a wandering laboring boy who grew up literally without education. He never did more in the way of writing than bunglingly write his own name. Abraham Lincoln.
Yet there was much about Thomas Lincoln that foreshadowed the appearance, personality, and character of his famous son. Many years later, Abraham Lincoln's law partner, William H. Herndon, interviewed a number of people, including Lincoln himself, about Thomas Lincoln. Herndon was able to piece together a description of Thomas Lincoln. It is the most complete physical description that we have.
Thomas Lincoln stood very erect, always had his face clean-shaved. He was 5'10" or 11 inches in height, with large bones and strong, heavy muscles. Not fat, weighing about 170, 175 pounds, with a medium-high forehead, straight nose, gray or light blue eyes, rather a broad face and black hair, which he wore combed straight down, cut off square at the ends and not combing his front locks behind his ears. It gave him something of a picturesque appearance. Thomas Lincoln was candid and truthful and amiable and sociable with everyone. He had a great stock of border anecdotes and professed a marvelous proclivity to entertain by spinning yarns and narrating his youthful experiences. William H. Herndon.
He served in the 4th Regiment, Washington County Militia in the summer of 1795.
Present. Fire! Shoulder your fire line.
Thomas Lincoln journeyed from Beech Fork to Elizabethtown, the county seat of Hardin County, Kentucky, as early as 1795. There he worked on a mill dam and mill on Severns Valley Creek for a prominent citizen of the town, Samuel Haycraft Jr., shown here in his 80s. Lincoln's work is illustrated by this pay ledger in the handwriting of Haycraft. Lincoln was then 18 years old. In the years ahead, Samuel Haycraft's signature as circuit court clerk and county court clerk would adorn almost every important document ever connected to Thomas Lincoln in Hardin County, Kentucky. Thomas Lincoln appears to have been an out-of-the-ordinary laborer. Samuel Haycraft Sr. and Jacob Van Meter, the two founders of Elizabethtown, used him here 7 years later as a witness to a promissory note entered into by and between both of them. Thomas Lincoln, it seems, returned to Beech Fork this February 1796 petition objecting to the building of a proposed road from Beech Fork to Chaplain's Fork presents a marvelous representation of the families living at Beech Fork. Families bearing the names Berry, Head, Mitchell, Montgomery, Thompson, and McLaughlin, among many others, appear. In bold handwriting also appears 18-year-old Thomas Lincoln, 23-year-old Josiah Lincoln, and 25-year-old Mordecai Lincoln. These are the earliest known signatures of Thomas Lincoln and his brothers. Thomas Lincoln appears again in Hardin County in 1802. By 1803, the records reveal that he purchased 238 acres of land on Mill Creek, about 7 miles north of Elizabethtown. He acquired that acreage for 118 English pounds after receiving a sum of money from the estate of his late father, Captain Lincoln. It is interesting to note that at the time Thomas Lincoln purchased the Mill Creek property, his mother, Bathsheba Lincoln, and his sister, Nancy, who had married a William Brumfield in 1801, were living along Mill Creek in Hardin County, having moved there from Beech Fork. Thomas, apparently, was very close to his mother, and he may have acquired that property for her. Bathsheba lived along Mill Creek until her death at 94 years of age in 1836. Nancy died there in 1843. Both are buried in the First Mill Creek Baptist Churchyard along Mill Creek in Hardin County. It has been conjectured by some Lincoln scholars that Thomas Lincoln finally determined to stay in Elizabethtown after he became an apprentice carpenter to a Joseph Hanks. What is known is that Thomas Lincoln became a very fine carpenter and joiner in Elizabethtown. Here, the ledger of the Bleakley and Montgomery store in Elizabethtown shows Thomas Lincoln purchasing carpentry tools, planes, files, and saws on credit in 1805.
What can I do for you, Thomas? Mr. Bleakley, I would like some...
From all the accounts of Thomas Lincoln's purchases at the Bleakley and Montgomery store, it appears he regularly smoked tobacco and imbibed whiskey, although there is no evidence indicating he was ever intemperate. In fact, most of those individuals having credit accounts purchased whiskey and tobacco in much greater amounts than Thomas Lincoln.
All right, thank you. You've got some more of these.
Thomas Lincoln would be given responsible positions in his new community. He would be at times a patroller, not too different from a deputy sheriff, a juror, a jury foreman, and a special bailiff for the Hardin Circuit Court, and even a county court-appointed appraiser of estates. Thomas Lincoln, it seems, had been courting Nancy Hanks, who was then living in the Beach Fork cabin of Francis Berry, the son of Richard Berry Sr., who had died in 1798. She was obviously one of the reasons Lincoln often returned to Beach Fork. For how long a time Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks courted is not known. Nancy Hanks must have been a woman of fine character. Although simple in background, learning, and attainments, she had a profound Christian faith and would become a caring and nurturing mother to her children. Abraham Lincoln's law partner, William H. Herndon, who interviewed individuals who remembered Nancy Hanks, including Abraham Lincoln, penned a description of her.
She was above the ordinary height and stature, weighed about 130 pounds, was slenderly built, and had much the appearance of one inclined to consumption or tuberculosis. Her skin was dark, hair brown, eyes gray and small, forehead prominent, face sharp and angular, with a marked expression of melancholy, which fixed itself in the memory of whoever saw or knew her. Though her life would seemingly be clouded by a spirit of sadness, she was, in disposition, amiable and generally cheerful. William H. Herndon.
Abraham Lincoln rarely spoke of his parents. One day, though, while Lincoln and William Herndon were riding in a buggy to attend court at Petersburg in Menard County, Illinois, Lincoln broke his silence on the subject.
God bless my mother. All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her. Abraham Lincoln.
Herndon claimed Lincoln then became very sad and absorbed in thought. According to this account, kept by the Bleakley and Montgomery store, Thomas Lincoln purchased silk on May 24, 1806, to give to his bride-to-be, most likely to be used with her wedding dress. Lincoln returned to Beach Fork, where on June 10, 1806, he entered into this marriage bond for the full sum of 50 pounds current money, guaranteeing that he would appear and marry Nancy Hanks. Richard Berry Jr. signed the bond as Nancy's guardian.
Dearly beloved, we come together to commence your union today.
The marriage of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks took place inside the two-story log cabin of Francis Berry on June 12, 1806. The marriage ceremony was performed by the Reverend Jesse Head, a 38-year-old Methodist Episcopal minister who was then living along Road Run, not far from the Lincolns and Berrys. The Reverend Jesse Head was a native of Frederick County, Maryland, who had migrated to Kentucky in 1795 and had been ordained a deacon by Bishop Francis Asbury in 1805. He was apparently a fine cabinet maker and a justice of the peace. He may have actually taught a very young Thomas Lincoln the rudiments of cabinet making and joining. Once the vows were exchanged, Francis Berry held what was called an in-fair. Family, neighbors, and even those who happened to come by were welcome to attend.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,
We had bear meat, venison, wild turkey and ducks, eggs, wild and tame, so common you could buy them at 2 bits a bushel. Maple sugar swung on a string to bite off for coffee or whiskey. Syrup in big gourds, peach and honey, a sheep that the 2 families barbecued whole over coals of wood burned in a pit and covered with green boughs to keep the juices in, and a race for the whiskey bottle. Christopher Columbus Graham.
In April 1807, the Reverend Jesse Head prepared this return, setting forth the marriages he had performed over the previous 12 months. Here, in the Reverend Jesse Head's own handwriting, he recorded officiating at the marriage of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks on June 12, 1806. In later years, it was said that Abraham Lincoln expressed doubts about whether his father and mother were ever married. If Abraham Lincoln had only seen this document that had been hidden in an annex to the Washington County Courthouse for many, many years, his concerns would have been put to rest. It has been said that Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks spent the first few days and nights of their married life in this simple cabin that stood along the rolling hills overlooking Beech Fork behind the home of Richard Berry, Jr. Thomas Lincoln soon brought his new wife to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where he continued his work as a carpenter and joiner. Thomas Lincoln and his new wife lived in this one-room log house on 2 leased lots in the town of Elizabethtown, situated near Severns Valley Creek. He possessed only 1 horse. On February 10, 1807, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to the Lincolns' first child, a daughter who they named Sarah in honor of Nancy's friend and possibly kinswoman, Sarah Shipley Mitchell of Beech Fork. In November 1807, Thomas Lincoln made what he thought was his first payment of $4.43 on a 200-acre homestead in Cumberland County, but a Samuel Biggerstaff entered his claim only hours before. Thomas Lincoln lost the property. A year later, on December 12, 1808, Thomas Lincoln paid an undetermined amount of money to an Elizabethtown friend, Isaac Bush, also a customer of the Bleakley and Montgomery store, in order for Bush to assign to Lincoln a contract previously assigned to Bush to purchase 300 acres of land on the waters of the South Fork of the Nolin River, 2½ miles south of Hodgenville. On that land was a notable sinking spring in a grove of trees called Little Turkey Grove. The acreage was known as the Sinking Spring Farm. Isaac Bush had been assigned the contract to buy the Sinking Spring Farm on November 2, 1805, from a mysterious figure named David Vance, a Bleakley and Montgomery store customer who, it appears, entered into the original land purchase agreement on May 1, 1805, with the owner of the Sinking Spring Farm, Richard Mather of Elizabethtown, yet another Bleakley and Montgomery store customer. The land purchase contract required Richard Mather to tender to David Vance the deed to the property upon Vance making full payment. Whether Vance ever actually paid Mather or Bush paid Vance for the land was not known to Thomas Lincoln at the time he was assigned the contract. As the contract was never recorded in the county clerk's office, there was no means by which Lincoln could have determined the exact status of the property. The Sinking Spring Farm was not prime land, but it was very good land. Relatively high, it was not prone to flooding. Although largely forested, there were some clearings, and with work, more land could be cleared for farming. The name of the farm was derived from a large sinking spring that flows today as it did in 1808 when Thomas Lincoln acquired it. Above the sinking spring, on a rolling ridge, stood a little single-room log cabin. This little cabin, the traditional structure that housed the Lincolns, may well contain some of the original logs. The cabin in which the Lincolns lived at the Sinking Spring Farm would have looked much like this one. Altogether, the Sinking Spring Farm was a good acquisition for a simple farmer like Thomas Lincoln. In that area of the county lived families with the names Sparrow, Hanks, Friend, and Walters. The Sparrows, Hanks, and Friends were probably important to Thomas Lincoln's decision to move to the Hodgenville area. Thomas and Elizabeth Sparrow and their adopted son, Dennis Hanks, lived in that area. The Sparrows and Dennis Hanks were undoubtedly related to Nancy Hanks. Indeed, Polly Hanks' Friend, the wife of Jesse Friend, was also related to Nancy. The Sinking Spring Farm was located about 2 miles from the Sparrow and Friend cabins. The Sinking Spring Farm never appeared on the Hardin County tax assessment records under Thomas Lincoln's name. It remained under the name of Richard Mather. Thomas Lincoln had moved there solely relying on David Vance having made full payment to Richard Mather. Under such tenuous circumstances, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln set out to clear the land, repair and furnish the simple one-room log cabin, and start life anew in the fashion both had known all their lives. The move to the Sinking Spring Farm was notable for another reason. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was pregnant again. It was in that little log cabin on Sunday morning, February 12, 1809, that Nancy gave birth to the couple's second child. Dennis Hanks, shown here in later life, recalled that Sunday morning.
Nancy was laying there in a pole bed looking pretty happy. Tom built up a good fire and throwed a bar skin over the kivers to keep them warm. You bet I was tickled to death. Babies wasn't as plentiful as blackberries in the woods of Kentucky. Dennis Hanks.
Dennis Hanks recalled that he asked Nancy what she was going to name the baby. She proudly responded, according to Hanks,
Abraham, after his grandfather, who came to Kentucky with Daniel Boone. Nancy Hanks.
Indeed, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln named the child Abraham in honor of Captain Abraham Lincoln, Thomas's father. Thus was born in a log cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln, the future 16th President of the United States. The Lincolns lived on the Sinking Spring Farm for only 2 years. David Vance never paid his obligation to Richard Mather for the balance due on the farm, even though he accepted what may have been the full price of the farm for his assignment of the land sale contract to Isaac Bush. Not having been paid, Richard Mather forced Thomas Lincoln to leave the premises, probably as early as 1811. Then, little Abraham Lincoln would have been only 2 years old. But Thomas Lincoln was determined to do all he could to recover that farm. Make no mistake about it, he was determined to stay in Kentucky and would fight to do so. Needing a place to live, Thomas Lincoln moved his family to this 30-acre site along Knob Creek, It was owned by a man named George Lindsay of Breckinridge County, who possessed in all 230 acres along the slopes of Muldrows Hill and the banks of Knob Creek. The acreage was a little more than 9 miles north of the Sinking Spring Farm and 7 miles north of Hodgenville. There was an unoccupied, one-room log cabin. Thomas Lincoln may have moved to the Knob Creek Farm believing it was abandoned. Only in 1815 does Thomas Lincoln appear on the Hardin County tax assessment records as possessing 30 acres along Knob Creek as a rent-paying tenant. The Knob Creek Farm was situated on the west side of the Bardstown and Green River Turnpike, a toll road that connected Louisville, Kentucky with Nashville, Tennessee. The little one-room log cabin occupied by the Lincolns faced the turnpike. Just north of the cabin flowed Knob Creek. The farm was all bottomland. It was relatively good soil for that part of Hardin County, but there was not much of it. The earliest record of the presence of Thomas Lincoln and his family at Knob Creek is this entry in the Hardin County Book of Estrays, dated May 11, 1811. Here, Thomas Lincoln records taking up on Knob Creek on the road leading from Bardstown to Nolin, an 8-year-old gray mare, 14 hands high, branded on the thigh and appraised at $20. The Knob Creek Farm was a poor substitute for the Sinking Spring Farm, but it was all Thomas Lincoln could find. He determined to live there, if possible, while he struggled to get the Sinking Spring Farm back.
The Knob Creek place I remember well, but I was not born there. I was born in Nolin, nearer Hodgenville than the Knob Creek place is. My earliest recollection, however, is of this Knob Creek place. Abraham Lincoln.
While entertaining a Dr. J.J. Wright of Emporia, Kansas, and others in the White House, President Lincoln remarked about his youth at Knob Creek.
I remember the old home very well. Our farm was composed of 3 fields which lay in a valley surrounded by high hills and deep gorges. Sometimes when there came a big rain in the hills, the water would come down the gorges and spread over the farm. The last thing I remember doing there was one Saturday afternoon, the other boys planted the corn in what we called the big field. It contained 7 acres, and I dropped the pumpkin seed. The next Sunday morning, there came a big rain in the hills. It did not rain a drop in the valley, but the water coming down through the gorges washed ground, corn, and pumpkin seeds all clear off the field. Abraham Lincoln.
One of little Abraham Lincoln's boyhood friends while living along Knob Creek was Austin Gollaher, whose family lived in a one-room cabin about 2 miles from the Lincolns. Gollaher, shown here in old age, remembered one Sunday at Knob Creek.
Abe and I played around all day. The creek was swollen by recent rain, and in crossing on the narrow footlog, Abe fell in. Neither of us could swim. I pulled him ashore. He was almost dead, and I was badly scared. I rolled and pounded him in good earnest, and then I got him by the arms and shook him, the water meanwhile pouring out of his mouth. By this means I succeeded in bringing him to, and he was soon all right. Austin Gollaher.
Abraham Lincoln and his sister Sarah attended their first school while living along Knob Creek. The school was a one-room log structure about 2 miles north of the Lincoln's Knob Creek Farm on the Bardstown and Green River Turnpike. It was about 15 feet square, with a fireplace at one side.
We were sent for short periods to ABC schools, the first kept by Zachariah Riney and the second by Caleb Hazel. Abraham Lincoln.
Thomas Lincoln could write relatively well and undoubtedly read. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was known only to have signed her name with an X, yet may have had some limited reading skills. In the household, the Lincolns kept this large family Bible. Given how much Abraham Lincoln studied Scripture and meticulously imitated its language in speeches and writings in later years, one wonders how much this old Bible was read to little Abraham Lincoln in the household along Knob Creek.
With fear and trembling.
Throughout the time Thomas Lincoln lived at Knob Creek, he struggled to recover the Sinking Spring farm from Richard Mather. It is known he actually approached Mather to pay off the debt of David Vance, but Mather refused, demanding the value owed to him by Vance to be paid in trade goods, which Thomas Lincoln did not have.
Please, Mr. Mather.
No, I want the trade goods.
Richard Mather finally filed an ejectment suit against David Vance, Isaac Bush, and Thomas Lincoln in the Hardin Circuit Court in Elizabethtown on September 1, 1813, seeking to put to rest all claims to the Sinking Spring farm. The order books of the Hardin Circuit Court reveal that David Vance was a defendant in at least 4 other lawsuits alleging similar acts brought by such notable residents as George Helm, Jacob Linder, James Crutcher, and Edward Thompson. In every one of the lawsuits brought against David Vance, he failed to appear. Isaac Bush and Thomas Lincoln had apparently been cheated out of their money. Lincoln retained a lawyer and filed his answer on September 7, 1813, asking the court to order Mather to transfer to him the Sinking Spring farm, or on his cross-claim to order Isaac Bush to pay him back the money he took from Lincoln for the assignment of the land sale contract. In order to obtain the money to pay his lawyer, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, in October 1814, sold to a Charles Melton 200 of the 238 acres of land he had purchased in 1803 along Mill Creek in Hardin County from the proceeds of his father's estate. In spite of the legal troubles, Thomas Lincoln continued his work as a carpenter and joiner at Knob Creek. From an examination of corner cupboards still extant that were believed to have been made by Thomas Lincoln, it is clear he was very familiar with fashionable furniture of the period. Many are very plain. This one was made while he lived at Knob Creek and bears the initials TL 1814. Another shown here is far more stylish and shows Thomas Lincoln's real skill as a cabinet maker. His carpentry and joining work was as fine as any in the early years of Kentucky's statehood. The Lincolns suffered a heart-rending loss while living along Knob Creek. A second son was born to Thomas and Nancy and died there. His name was Thomas. How long little Thomas lived is not known. He probably died in 1814. Abraham Lincoln was no more than 5 years old at the time. Being a carpenter and a joiner, Thomas Lincoln fashioned the little casket in his cabin. On the brow of Muldraw's Hill, 6 miles distant, lived George Redmond and his family. Not wanting to bury the remains of little Thomas on land they did not own, the Lincolns obtained permission from George Redmond to use his family cemetery.
Oh, our most gracious Heavenly Father, take our precious son into your loving arms.
To that little, remote family cemetery of the Redmonds,
Amen.
the Lincolns carried the casket containing the remains of little Thomas. There they were buried, and this stone, crudely marked TL by Thomas Lincoln, was placed over the grave. Nearby are the graves of Redmond infants who died about the same time as little Thomas. It is hard for us today to imagine how incredibly difficult life was in Kentucky during the early years of settlement. Death was a frequent visitor to every household. The remote Redmond family cemetery is a stark reminder of how hard and oftentimes sad life was for those early settlers like the Lincolns. Thomas Lincoln's legal problems mounted. On December 27, 1815, he was served with a summons requiring him to appear as a defendant to defend yet another lawsuit, this one brought by the heirs of a Thomas Middleton of Philadelphia, who claimed they owned title to a vast acreage in Hardin County that included the Lincolns' Knob Creek Farm. Every one of Lincoln's neighbors, the Redmonds, Ashes, La Follettes, Brownfields, Dyes, and Stranges, were named as defendants as the Middleton heirs claimed title to 10,000 acres in what was then Hardin County. The Middleton heirs' lawyer was none other than Charles A. Wickliffe, the young, politically well-connected resident of Bardstown who had been twice elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives from Nelson County, Kentucky. He would eventually become governor of Kentucky, congressman, and postmaster general of the United States. Thomas Lincoln remained in rather high esteem in his community in spite of all his land troubles. On May 13, 1816, the Hardin County Court appointed him surveyor of that part of the road leading from No Lynn to Bardstown, which lies between the Big Hill and the Rolling Fork. The previous surveyor was Lincoln's friend and neighbor, George Redmond. On September 12, 1816, Judge Alfred Metcalf entered this judgment in the case involving the Sinking Spring Farm, ordering it sold on the courthouse steps.
Said Vance or other defendants or either of them.
Metcalf ruled in favor of Thomas Lincoln on his claim against Isaac Bush, but Lincoln lost the Sinking Spring Farm. He had no money to buy the property at auction. It was a devastating blow to Thomas Lincoln. The Sinking Spring Farm was sold on the courthouse steps in Elizabethtown on December 19, 1816, for $87.74. Thomas Lincoln had lived in Kentucky for 34 years, and he had fought hard to stay there. It is important to know that he never, ever wanted to leave Kentucky. But after Judge Metcalf's ruling, all of his lands there had been lost. On the heels of Judge Metcalf's ruling on the Sinking Spring Farm, Lincoln packed up his little family, Nancy, Sarah, and 7-year-old Abraham, on 3 horses and a mule, with an ox-drawn wagon carrying what furnishings they owned, and moved to Indiana in the late fall of 1816. He had no other options. The Lincolns must have stopped in Elizabethtown to say their goodbyes to all their friends, and at Mill Creek to bid farewell to Bathsheba Lincoln and Thomas's sister Nancy and her husband and children. To get to Indiana, the Lincolns traveled across Hardin County to Breckinridge County, where they sojourned in Hardinsburg, Kentucky. They then crossed the Ohio River, either at Cloverport, Kentucky, by way of a log ferry owned by a man named Jacob Weatherholt, or by Hugh Thompson's ferry, across from the mouth of Anderson Creek. They finally settled on a tract of land in Perry, now Spencer County, Indiana, along Little Pigeon Creek. They journeyed nearly 120 miles to get there. The territorial government of Indiana had formally surveyed all the lands there, and a settler could rely upon his claim being secure. Tracing the footsteps of the Lincolns to Indiana the following year would be Nancy Hanks Lincoln's kin from Hodgenville, Thomas and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow, and their foster son, Dennis Hanks.
Call your witness.
Benjamin Wright, County Surveyor.
Thomas Lincoln returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky often. He continued to defend the lawsuit brought by the Middleton heirs, as he had already expended money doing so, and he could recover all his costs and expenses from the Middleton heirs if he prevailed.
Counsel, you may proceed.
The Hardin Circuit Court ordered the lands claimed by the Middleton heirs to be surveyed. Hardin County Surveyor Benjamin Wright introduced this remarkable survey during the jury trial on June 9, 1818. Thomas Lincoln was present with his counsel. The red dot marked number 7 is the site of the cabin along Knob Creek, formerly occupied by Thomas Lincoln and his family. Thomas Lincoln and George Lindsay finally prevailed in the lawsuit brought by the Middleton heirs when the jury found for them, and Judge Metcalf entered a judgment on June 9, 1818. After Thomas Lincoln returned to Indiana, tragedy struck again. On October 5, 1818, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died of, probably, brucellosis, a disease she contracted from the milk of infected cows that fed on snake root. She was only 35 years old. Abraham Lincoln was 9 years old. Death had struck the Lincoln family for the second time in 4 years. Nancy was buried in a family graveyard after Thomas Lincoln read scripture and led the family and a few neighbors in prayers. Nearby are the graves of Thomas and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow, who also died of the same illness that year. Thomas Lincoln was hardly through with Kentucky, though. He returned often to visit his mother. He also began visiting an old friend in Elizabethtown, Sarah Bush Johnston, whose husband, Daniel Johnston, the Hardin County jailer, had died in 1816. While in Elizabethtown, Thomas Lincoln attempted to get the Middleton heirs to pay his court costs and expenses in the months after he won the jury case, but without success. Then, on May 17, 1819, he returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and filed suit in the Hardin Circuit Court against John Kennedy as the surety on the bond of the Middleton heirs' lawsuit. Lincoln was eventually awarded a judgment against Kennedy for all the costs and expenses defending the lawsuit of the Middleton heirs, as well as a penal sum for the Middletons' failure to pay. Thomas Lincoln used those appearances before the Hardin Circuit Court as opportunities to be with Sarah Bush Johnston. Clearly, Sarah illustrated to Lincoln that she was interested in his advances. Thomas Lincoln returned to Elizabethtown often. This marriage bond and license was signed by none other than Thomas Lincoln's first employer, Samuel Haycraft Jr., as county clerk. Thomas again returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and on December 2, 1819, married Sarah Bush Johnston, shown here in a photograph taken late in her life. Sarah would raise young Abraham Lincoln and his sister Sarah, along with her own 3 children. In 1828, Abraham Lincoln's 21-year-old sister Sarah, who had married an Aaron Grigsby, died. Death struck the Lincolns again. She was buried in the Little Pigeon Creek Baptist Churchyard. 2 years later, the Lincolns moved to Illinois. At a place called Goose Nest Prairie in Coles County, the Lincolns settled again. From there, Abraham Lincoln moved out on his own. The rest of his life is history. Thomas Lincoln died in Coles County in 1851. Sarah Bush Lincoln would actually outlive her illustrious stepson, dying in Coles County in 1869 at the age of 81 years. Abraham Lincoln financially supported his stepmother throughout the years following the death of his father, Thomas. Like his father, Abraham Lincoln always identified himself as a Kentuckian. He married Mary Todd of Lexington, Kentucky. All of his law partners, John Todd Stewart, Stephen T. Logan, and William H. Herndon, were born in Kentucky. Many of Lincoln's closest friends and political confidants were Kentuckians, including James Speed and Orville H. Browning. After his marriage to Mary Todd, he became close friends with her half-sister Emily Todd and Emily's husband, Benjamin Hardin Helm of Elizabethtown, Kentucky, grandson of Benjamin Helm. As a Confederate brigadier general, Helm would die of wounds received at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. Before he was elected to the presidency in 1860, Abraham Lincoln even carried on a correspondence with the aged Samuel Haycraft Jr. in an attempt to learn more about his mother and father. Although he was born and lived in Kentucky only 7 years, Abraham Lincoln, in many ways, believed those years defined him. "I, too, am a Kentuckian," he once remarked. Indeed, he was a Kentuckian and was extraordinarily proud of it. He was born there at a time when most Kentuckians lived as he and his family lived. They built and occupied one-room log cabins. The heads of those households eked out a living on subsistence farms while performing various types of labor in their communities. Sickness and death were frequent visitors. Their lives were often very sad. They were mostly poor, but they built a nation. And for Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, their son, in whom they instilled faith, honesty, and an indomitable will to succeed, became the 16th President of the United States. The president who fought to keep the nation united through a bloody civil war, and whose efforts resulted in more than 4 million African-American slaves being freed from bondage. Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln's son, Abraham Lincoln, although born in a simple log cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky, adorns the pages of history as one of the greatest figures of the English-speaking world.
I Remember the Old Home Very Well. The Lincolns in Kentucky has been brought to you by the Hardin County History Museum and the Ancestral Trails Historical Society, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. A sense of past time and place. Dupree Financial Group, Lexington, Kentucky. The citizens of LaRue County and Hodgenville, Kentucky. The Springfield Tourism Commission, Springfield, Kentucky. The McConnell Center at the University of Louisville, Louisville, Kentucky. The Bourbon County Distilling Company, Paris, Kentucky. The Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and the Lincoln Forum, New York, New York. And the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, Lincoln Memorial University, Harrogate, Tennessee. And generous gifts from Bill and Dottie Spears, Paris, Kentucky. Mac and Sharon Cox, Richmond, Kentucky, and Dr. Priscilla Lind, Lexington, Kentucky.